Hi, folks. Before we jump into our first project, I want to talk about a few of the basic ideas behind interaction of color so that you understand the kind of teaching and art philosophy that are behind these projects. Now, the first lesson is that this is essentially an experimental way of working, meaning we're not studying systems of color per se. We're not studying the sort of physical, factual definitions of color, but we're studying color in context, color in relationship to other colors. One thing that Joseph Albers would always say is that color is the most relative medium in art. That means that as we perceive it, it never really seems as it actually is, as it physically is, like I sort of said before. It's totally relative to its context. What we're going to be noticing in these projects is that there are innumerable readings that are evoked in color. So that in different contexts, in different interactions of color, for example, two different colors can seem alike or nearly alike, and a single color could feel different when it's compared to other colors. And that'll make more sense as we move along. I won't go over this too much, but the idea behind working this way, by playing with color, for instance, is to develop through experience and trial and error an eye for color. This will train us to be observant and to be articulate about color, to be able to notice and point out what's going on. It's key that we place practice before theory here, which is, of course, what happens anyway. Theory comes after practice. We have to sort of understand what's happened. So we're going to be experimenting a lot in the beginning. As we understand and sort of learn about what's going on, we're not going to be talking about so much theory. In the end of the course, we're going to talk about the color wheel and about all these different types of color. We're going to go over a real glossary of color terms at that point, because then we'll really know what we're dealing with. But for now, we're just going to sort of play around. It's important to remember that we don't really need to think about color so much as physics. We don't need to be thinking about optics. We don't need to be thinking about physiology of visual perception so much. For the same reason that understanding acoustics doesn't make us more musical, and understanding theories of composition don't make us better artists. The idea here is that we're going to go through a series of practical exercises that will demonstrate the relativity and instability of color. Now, what matters with that is that it's not knowledge that matters so much as vision. It's not facts that matter so much as seeing and understanding. Seeing, the way Joseph Albers describes it, implies the word schauen in German, which I may be mispronouncing, or another German word I can't pronounce. The German connotation is also connected to the ideas of fantasy and imagination. So by dealing directly with color, we're not dealing so much with representation, but with the imagination. Each exercise will be explained and illustrated, not to give us a specific answer, but to suggest a way of study. Okay, next. Another important concept for Joseph Albers is on color recollection or visual memory. Okay? Let's talk about the color red. If we say the letter red and 50 people are listening, we can expect that we'll get 50 different color reds in everyone's mind, right? 50 different kinds of red. We can be sure that all these reds will be different. Even when a certain color is specified to all the listeners, such as the red of the Coca-Cola sign, which is the same everywhere, all over the world, everyone is still going to think of a different red. We can guarantee it. Even if all the listeners have hundreds of reds in front of them, say imagine a big table full of red color swatches, nobody could pick out the right Coca-Cola red. It would be impossible. And even if we saw that red Coca-Cola sign, like on that screen, like it's on the screen now, we can't even be sure that everyone is perceiving the exact same color red. There's no way to know this. What does this show? First, it shows that it is hard, if not impossible, to remember distinct colors. This shows that our visual memory is very poor in comparison with our auditory memory, which is often not even that great. But visual memory is very poor. Second, what this shows is that the nomenclature of color is inadequate. There are innumerable colors, shades and tones of color in our daily vocabulary, right? Yet there are only about 30 color names. Next, another big thing that Joseph Albers talked about is color reading and contexture. So we're going to talk a bit about typography here and about shape and about gestalt, which I've mentioned in class a bit. A big question I have that I think is important to this section is about why. Why are we making paintings, for instance? Why are we making art? The reason we have these examples of text on the screen is because this kind of analogy about the idea in modern typography about simpler letter forms being clear and about being effective for their simplicity. But what was discovered is that this was wrong, and that's because people don't understand reading through letters, but through words. They understand reading through word pictures. This is what Gestalt psychology says, is that someone reads a word and they have a picture in their mind. Now, without getting too involved, you can see, for example, on the bottom left, this capitalized sans serif letter, and how all the letters are kind of the same shape. They're the same height, they're the same width, they have straight lines, and they become very difficult to read. It becomes a bit easier to read, the one example above, because they have serifs. They have little bits on the end of the letter forms, serifs. It gets easier to read when there's mixed case letters, capitals and lowercase letters. And it's the most easiest to read when it's a serif letter case. It's important to recognize that sans serifs were designed as letters not for text but for captions. But you know, in a book, you're going to have a sans serif letter. You're going to have a serif mixed case letter like in the top right example here. Makes for easier reading. What this illustrates is that clear reading depends upon the recognition of context. And to compare this to music, to poetry, and to art again, in musical compositions, we never hear merely one tone. Hearing music depends on the recognition of the in-between tones, of their placing and of their spacing, right? So the more shapes, the more lines, the more spaces, the easier it is to comprehend. In poetry, knowledge of spelling has nothing to do with understanding poetry, right? It's all about that spacing. Our concern with the interaction of color, therefore, is seeing what happens between colors. And it's important to understand that because we never, though we are able to hear a single tone, we can never see a single color. We always see colors in relationships to one another. Colors are always presenting themselves in flux and under changing conditions. Okay, this last bit on the importance of this sort of study is why digital. Joseph Albers is all about using cut paper, right? But in our course, we're going to be using digital. So why paper? This image to me is of a wonderful classroom where people are physically touching. They're together. They're working all on the same thing together. It's amazing, right? But we're not there, unfortunately. So we can't do that. But Paper is amazing compared to paint for a number of reasons, including you get to make this amazing, vast collection, which is affordable. And the way you do that is you collect it from sources such as printers, bookbinders, packing papers. You find it in wrapping. You find it in decoration papers. You get it from magazines, advertisements, illustrations, posters, wallpapers, paint samples, catalogs. So this idea of all coming together, collecting these things, and creating this sort of community palette is what's wonderful. Paint, on the other hand, is inconsistent. It's going to be thick, it's going to be thin, it's going to have texture, whereas paper is flat. There's also the sort of factor of failure that comes with paint, where there's a learning curve. And with paper, we skip over that and make it available to everybody, thus sort of keeping everyone engaged, right? Lastly, paper is consistent, whereas paint is not, and you need less equipment to work with paper, which we've found in working with paper already in class. Now, what we're going to be doing will be interesting because we're going to be working digitally. We get to find out, is that boring? Without the community, without the physicality, without the having to find the paper, having to discover this wonderful hue and shade. Without all that, do we lose that nature of art that connects us to it? I don't know. I don't think so. I think we're going to learn about color on a very private, personal level. And that's going to be really interesting. And it's going to tie us into this kind of 21st century app, cell phone, smartphone, digital nature, world, global sort of ecosystem that we're in, right? So that's that. That's the kind of philosophy behind the project. Thank you.